A crown stood waiting, but no one in Britain truly knew the man who would wear it. In the uneasy silence following a queen's death, whispers filled courtrooms and corridors. The throne could not remain empty, but neither could it return to a Catholic line. So a decision was made, not by destiny, but by necessity. A foreign name, a distant bloodline, a choice that would secure religion, yet quietly fracture belonging. Across the Channel, in the quiet lands of Hanover, a prince received the news. He was not raised for this kingdom. He did not speak its language. He did not understand its people. And yet, in 1714, he would become their king. When George I arrived in Britain, he carried power in his title but distance in his eyes. His court felt unfamiliar, his subjects uncertain, and his crown heavy with expectation. He ruled, but he did not belong. What began as a solution to a political crisis would slowly become something far more fragile, a dynasty built on duty, marked by isolation, and shadowed by a truth no crown could hide. Because sometimes, gaining a kingdom is the very moment you begin to lose it. Asterisk. Long before the British crown found its way into Hanoverian hands, the family itself existed far from the center of European power. The Electorate of Hanover, a modest German principality within the Holy Roman Empire, was not a kingdom of grandeur, but one of quiet political calculation. Its rulers were not the wealthiest, nor the most feared, but they were patient, disciplined, and deeply rooted in Protestant identity. The Hanoverians' early environment shaped their priorities. Surrounded by larger powers like Prussia and Austria, survival depended less on military strength and more on alliances, careful diplomacy, and religious alignment. Their Protestant faith, in particular, would become the defining factor that eventually altered their destiny. At the time, religion was not merely belief, it was political currency. In England, this same religious tension was reaching a breaking point. The fear of a Catholic monarchy returning after decades of conflict weighed heavily on Parliament. Memories of religious persecution and civil war had not faded. Stability, to them, meant securing a Protestant future at any cost even. If it meant breaking traditional lines of succession. This led to one of the most consequential decisions in British history, the Act of Settlement in 1701. The law explicitly barred Catholics from inheriting the throne and instead identified Sophia of Hanover, granddaughter of James I, as the closest Protestant heir. In doing so, Parliament bypassed more than 50 individuals with stronger hereditary claims, each excluded solely because of their faith. The decision was controversial, even unsettling. It prioritized ideology over bloodline, creating a monarchy not entirely chosen by heritage, but by political necessity. Sophia herself never ruled. She died in 1714, just weeks before Queen Anne. Yet her position had already secured the path for her son. What makes this moment striking is not simply the shift in succession, but what it revealed. The British crown, long associated with divine right and inherited legitimacy, had been reshaped by human fear and political calculation. It was no longer just a symbol of lineage, it had become a tool of control. For the House of Hanover, this was the beginning of an unexpected ascent. They had not fought for the British throne, nor deeply desired it, but circumstances shaped by religion, fear, and strategy had quietly placed it within their reach. What they gained, however, was not simply power. It was a kingdom that would always see them as outsiders. Asterisk. In 1714, following the death of Queen Anne, the carefully constructed plan of Parliament came into effect. George, Elector of Hanover, was declared King George I of Great Britain. It was a transition that secured Protestant succession, but it also introduced a ruler who was, in almost every sense, disconnected from the nation he was meant to lead. When George I arrived in London, the divide was immediately clear. He spoke little English, preferred German company, and showed limited interest in British customs. Court life which had long revolved around shared language and cultural understanding, now felt distant and fragmented. Many within the aristocracy viewed him not as a natural sovereign, but as a political solution yet unfamiliar. Faced with these limitations, George I made a decision that would quietly reshape the structure of British governance. Rather than attempt to directly control every aspect of rule, he delegated increasing authority to his ministers. Among them, one figure would rise above the rest. Robert Walpole's influence grew, not through formal declaration, but through necessity. He managed finances, guided policy, and maintained stability in a court that lacked clear royal direction. Over time, he became what many would later recognize as Britain's first prime minister. This shift marked a subtle but profound transformation, the beginning of a monarchy that ruled less by direct command and more through political intermediaries. Yet this delegation was not without risk. It created distance between the king and his people, reinforcing the perception that George I was detached from the realities of British life. While the system brought stability, it also weakened the personal authority of the crown. The king remained the symbol of power, but increasingly, he was no longer its active source. At the same time, the new dynasty faced immediate threats to its legitimacy. The Jacobite supporters of the exiled Catholic Stuart Linley refused to accept the Hanoverian claim. In 1715, a major uprising sought to restore James Francis Edward Stuart to the throne. It was not just a rebellion, but a direct challenge to the very principle that had placed George I in power. The response was swift and decisive. Government forces suppressed the rebellion, reinforcing the authority of the new king and demonstrating that Parliament's decision would be upheld by force, if necessary. Though tensions remained, the failure of the uprising marked the first significant victory for the Hanoverian dynasty. This early success secured more than just the throne. It stabilized a fragile political order. Britain avoided the chaos of contested succession, and the Hanoverians proved capable of maintaining control, even in the face of resistance. But beneath this stability lay an emerging truth. Power had been preserved, not through connection, but through structure. George I had secured his rule, yet he had done so by stepping back rather than stepping forward. And in that quiet withdrawal, the nature of the British monarchy had already begun to change. Asterisk. The foundations laid during George I's reign did not merely stabilize the Hanoverian position, they created a system that would allow the dynasty to endure. When George II ascended the throne in 1727, he inherited not only a kingdom, but a structure of governance already shifting away from absolute royal control. Unlike his father, George II made greater efforts to engage with British political life, yet the pattern of reliance on ministers remained firmly in place. Under his rule, Britain continued to strengthen its position within Europe, carefully balancing diplomacy and conflict. The monarchy, though still central in image, increasingly operated within a system where parliament and political figures held growing influence. This balance allowed the Hanoverians to maintain authority without provoking the instability that had once plagued earlier dynasties. It was not dominance that defined their power, but endurance. At the same time, Britain's global ambitions began to expand. Trade routes widened, colonial interests deepened, and the foundations of empire grew stronger. By the time George III came to power in 1760, Britain was no longer simply a European player, it was becoming a global force. George III represented something different from his predecessors. Born in Britain and fluent in English, he was determined to be seen not as a foreign ruler, but as a true British king. His early reign carried a sense of renewed connection between monarch and people. There was a belief, perhaps even a hope, that the distance which had defined the early Hanoverian years might finally be closed. But with this desire for connection came a renewed ambition for control. Unlike his grandfather, George III did not wish to remain distant from governance. He sought to reassert royal influence, to guide policy more directly, and to shape the direction of the nation according to his own judgment. It was a shift that appeared, at first, to restore strength to the crown. Yet this expansion of influence came at a cost that was not immediately visible. The growing British Empire, while a symbol of success, also brought increasing complexity. Managing distant colonies required delicate balance firm enough to maintain authority, yet flexible enough to accommodate local realities. George III's approach, however, leaned toward control rather than compromise. In the American colonies, this tension slowly began to surface. Measures such as the Stamp Act of 1765, intended to raise revenue and assert authority, were met with resistance. What the Crown saw as a reasonable governance, the colonies perceived as overreach. The phrase "no taxation without representation" echoed across the Atlantic, capturing a growing sense of alienation. At first, these disputes seemed manageable mere disagreements within a vast and expanding empire, but beneath the surface, they reflected a deeper issue, the challenge of maintaining authority over people who no longer felt represented by it. The same distance that had once existed between George I and his British subjects was now emerging, on a much larger scale, stretching across oceans. Meanwhile, within Britain, the monarchy continued to adapt to its evolving role. Parliament's influence expanded steadily, shaping legislation and policy with increasing confidence. The Crown, though still powerful in appearance, was gradually becoming part of a broader system rather than standing above it. This transformation allowed stability to endure, but it also limited the monarchy's ability to act independently. George III found himself at the center of this tension between tradition and change, authority and adaptation. His determination to strengthen royal influence placed him in a difficult position. Each decision carried not only political consequences, but also the weight of expectation from a public that had begun to view monarchy through a different lens. As Britain's power grew, so too did the pressures placed upon its rulers. Expansion brought prestige, but it also demanded control over forces that were increasingly difficult to manage. The empire was no longer a simple extension of authority. It had become a complex network of interests, identities, and expectations. And within this complexity, a subtle but critical shift was taking place. The Hanoverians had secured their place on the throne, built stability, and overseen the rise of a global empire. Yet the very success of their rule was creating new challenges that could not be resolved through tradition alone. What appeared to be the height of their power was, in many ways, the beginning of a deeper vulnerability. Because the more the Crown tried to hold everything together, the more it risked losing control over what it had built. But a mid-century, the British Empire had grown vast, stretching across oceans and continents. Among its most valuable possessions were the American colonies, prosperous, expanding, and increasingly so. For years, they had benefited from a degree of autonomy, governing their internal affairs while remaining loyal to the Crown. But beneath this stability, a quiet tension had begun to form. The end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 marked a turning point. Britain had emerged victorious, securing dominance over rival European powers. Yet the war had come at a significant financial cost. Faced with mounting debt, the British government turned its attention to the colonies, viewing them not only as territories to protect, but as sources of revenue. It was here that the first real conflict between George III and the American colonies took shape, not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through a series of decisions that gradually eroded trust. In 1765, the introduction of the Stamp Act required colonists to pay taxes on printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents. To the British government, it was a reasonable measure to help cover the costs of imperial defense. To the colonists, it was something entirely different. The issue was not simply taxation, it was representation. The colonies had no elected officials in Parliament, no direct voice in the decisions that affected their lives. The principle that followed, no taxation without representation, captured a growing frustration that could no longer be ignored. What had once been a distant authority now felt intrusive, even oppressive. For George III, the situation was complex. He saw the colonies as part of a unified empire, bound by shared responsibility. From his perspective, taxation was not an act of tyranny, but of fairness. Yet this viewpoint revealed a critical disconnect. The king and his government viewed the empire as a single entity, while the colonies increasingly saw themselves as distinct communities with their own rights and identities. This was the true beginning of the rivalry, not a battle of armies, but a clash of ideas, authority versus autonomy, control versus consent. Each side believed itself justified, and neither fully understood the other. What made this conflict particularly dangerous was its subtlety. There was no immediate collapse, no clear break. Instead, resentment grew slowly, quietly embedding itself into the fabric of colonial life. Protests began to emerge, boycotts were organized, and resistance shifted from words to action. The connection between crown and colony, once stable, had begun to fracture. And in that first fracture lay the seeds of a conflict that would soon reshape not only an empire, but the very meaning of power itself. What began as protests soon hardened into resistance. The repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766 briefly eased tensions, but it did not resolve the deeper issue. Instead, it revealed something far more troubling. For the crown, the colonies were willing to challenge authority, and they could succeed. This realization only deepened the divide between Britain and America. In the years that followed, Parliament introduced new measures, each intended to reinforce control, yet each further damaging trust. The Townshend Acts of 1767 plus set duties on imported goods such as glass, paper, and tea. Once again, the reasoning appeared practical from Britain's perspective, yet in the colonies, the response was immediate and organized. Boycotts spread across cities, merchants refused British goods, and resistance became a collective effort rather than isolated discontent. The situation escalated not only through policy, but through presence. British troops were stationed in colonial cities to maintain order, but their arrival was seen less as protection and more as occupation. Tensions between civilians and soldiers grew increasingly volatile, culminating in the Boston Massacre of 1770. Though the number of casualties was small, the symbolic impact was immense. It transformed political disagreement into something far more emotional: fear and a sense of injustice. For George III and his government, maintaining authority became a matter of principle. To concede too much risked weakening the empire. If the American colonies could defy Parliament, what message would that send to other territories? Control, once challenged, had to be reinforced. Yet each attempt to do so only pushed the colonies further away. The Tea Act of 1773 was another attempt to stabilize imperial finances, but it triggered one of the most iconic acts of defiance: Boston Tea Party. Colonists, disgusted and determined, destroyed shipments of British tea in a direct rejection of authority. It was no longer a question of negotiation. The line had been crossed. In response, Britain introduced the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These measures were designed to punish and reassert control, closing the port of Boston and tightening governance. Instead of restoring order, they united the colonies in opposition. What had once been regional grievances began to transform into a shared identity. The rivalry had now moved beyond policy and into perception. Britain saw rebellion. The colonies saw resistance. The king believed he was preserving unity. The colonists believed they were defending liberty. Between these two views, compromise became increasingly impossible. Amid this growing conflict, George III faced mounting pressure not only from the colonies, but from within Britain itself. Critics questioned the handling of the situation, while supporters demanded from the king, determined to maintain authority, chose not to retreat. It was a decision rooted in conviction, but one that carried consequences he could not fully control. By 1775, the tension that had been building for a decade finally broke into open conflict. The first shots of war were fired at Lexington and marking the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. What had once been a dispute over taxes had transformed into a struggle for independence. And in that transformation, rivalry between crown and colony became something irreversible. Asterisk. The outbreak of war in 1775 marked a decisive shift in the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. What had once been a political disagreement had now become a full struggle, forcing both sides to confront the reality of separation. For the Hanoverian monarchy, this was not merely a military challenge, it was a test of legitimacy, authority, and identity on a global stage. At first, there was confidence within Britain that the rebellion could be contained. The empire had faced resistance before and had always managed to reassert control. Yet this conflict was different. The American colonies were not distant outposts with limited resources. They were organized, motivated, and increasingly unified. They were fighting, not just against policies, but against the very idea of external rule. As the war progressed, the scale of the challenge became clearer. The involvement of foreign powers, particularly France, transformed the conflict into an international struggle. What had begun as an internal dispute now carried broader geopolitical consequences. Britain found itself stretched, balancing military efforts across multiple fronts while attempting to maintain stability at home. For George III, the war represented both a personal and political crisis. His determination to preserve the empire remained firm, yet each setback weakened his position. Victories were often temporary, and losses carried lasting consequences. The surrender at Yorktown in 1781 marked a turning point that could no longer be ignored. It signaled not just military defeat, but the collapse of Britain's authority over the colonies. Asterisk. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognized American independence. For the Hanoverian dynasty, this was a moment of profound significance. The empire had lost one of its most valuable territories, and the monarchy had suffered a blow to its prestige. What had once been a symbol of expanding power now carried the memory of failure. Asterisk. Yet even in defeat, Britain did not collapse. Instead, it began to redefine its position in the world. Attention shifted toward other parts of the empire, particularly in Asia and the Caribbean, where influence continued to grow. Trade expanded, industries developed, and the early stages of the Industrial Revolution began to reshape society. Britain remained powerful, but the nature of that power was changing. Within this transformation, the monarchy faced its own internal challenges. Public perception became increasingly important. The king was no longer viewed solely as a distant authority figure, but as a symbol his image needed to align with the expectations of a changing society. George III's earlier attempts to assert control now stood in contrast to a growing belief that governance should reflect broader representation. Compounding this tension was the king's deteriorating health. Periods of mental instability raised concerns about his ability to rule, creating uncertainty within both government and public life. During these episodes, authority shifted further toward ministers and parliament, reinforcing a trend that had begun decades earlier. The monarchy, once central to was gradually becoming more symbolic in its function. At the same time, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, began to emerge as a prominent figure. His lifestyle, marked by extravagance and indulgence, contrasted sharply with the values many in Britain had come to admire. While the nation was undergoing economic and social change, the future king appeared disconnected from these realities. This contrast deepened the divide between public expectation and royal behavior. Despite these challenges, Britain's victory in the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815 helped restore a sense of national pride. The defeat of Napoleon positioned Britain as a dominant European power, reaffirming its influence on the global stage. For a time, this success softened the impact of earlier losses and allowed the monarchy to regain some measure of respect. However, this restored prestige did not erase the underlying changes that had taken place. The balance of power had shifted permanently. Parliament had become the driving force of governance, while the monarchy adapted to a role defined more by representation than control. The crown still carried immense symbolic weight, but its authority was now shaped by the institutions surrounding it. The Hanoverian dynasty had entered Britain as outsiders seeking acceptance. Over time, they had secured their place within the nation's identity, but not in the way they might have intended. Acceptance came not through dominance, but through adaptation. And in that adaptation lay a quiet truth. The battle for status had been won, but only by surrendering the very power that once defined it. By the early 19th century, Britain stood as one of the most powerful nations in the world. The defeat of Napoleon in 1815 had secured its dominance across Europe, and its empire continued to expand across distant territories. On the surface, stability had been restored, the crown remained intact, the nation respected, and the Hanover dynasty still firmly in place. Yet beneath this appearance of strength, a different reality was beginning to take shape. The years following the war brought significant social and economic strain. Industrial growth was transforming cities, drawing populations into crowded urban centers where poverty and inequality became increasingly visible. The prosperity of empire did not reach everyone, and dissatisfaction quietly grew among those who felt excluded from its benefits. At the same time, expectations of governance were changing. The public had begun to demand greater representation, influenced by both the earlier American example and the wider shifts taking place across Europe. Calls for reform were no longer isolated. Voices they were becoming part of a broader movement, questioned the concentration of power within a limited elite. Within this evolving environment, the monarchy faced a new kind of challenge. It was no longer simply about maintaining authority, but about maintaining relevance. The crown needed to reflect a society that was no longer willing to accept unquestioned control, yet the royal family itself appeared increasingly out of step. With these changes, the transition of power added further complexity. George III's declining health had already shifted authority toward his son, the Prince Regent, who would later become George IV. His leadership, however, did little to reassure the public. Known for his lavish lifestyle and indulgent habits, he became a symbol of excess at a time when many were struggling. The contrast between royal luxury and public hardship deepened resentment. Political pressure continued to build. Reform movements gained momentum, advocating for changes to the electoral system and greater inclusion within Parliament. These demands were not merely about policies, they represented a fundamental shift in how power was understood. Authority was no longer seen as something inherited without question, but as something that needed to be justified and shared. As these tensions grew, it became clear that the existing balance could not hold indefinitely. The structures that had supported the monarchy were being reshaped by forces beyond its direct control. Economic change, public opinion, and political reform were converging, creating a moment of uncertainty that would soon demand a response. The stage was set not for a battle fought with armies, but for a confrontation that would redefine the relationship between crown and people. And unlike the conflicts of the past, this one could not be resolved through victory alone. The tensions that had been building beneath the surface of British society now moved into the open, finding their focus in the reign of George IV. When he officially ascended the throne in 1820, expectations were uncertain. After years as Prince Regent, he was already a familiar figure, but not one widely admired. What followed would not be a single dramatic clash, but a series of confrontations that exposed the growing divide between monarchy and people. At the center of this conflict stood his marriage to Caroline of Brunswick. Long estranged and marked by mutual hostility, their relationship had been a source of quiet scandal for years. Yet upon becoming king, George IV sought to formally dissolve the marriage and strip Caroline of her royal status. What might have remained a private matter instead became a public spectacle. Caroline returned to Britain to defend her position, and in doing so, captured the attention and sympathies of the public. To many, she appeared not as a disgraced queen, but as a woman wronged by a powerful and self-indulgent monarch. Crowds gathered in her support, turning legal proceedings into moments of national drama. The attempt to remove her title, presented in Parliament as a matter of justice, was widely perceived as an abuse of power. This confrontation revealed something deeper than personal conflict. It exposed the fragile relationship between the monarchy and public opinion. For the first time in a significant way, the authority of the crown was being openly questioned, not through rebellion, but through judgment. The people were not rising against the monarchy, but they were no longer willing to accept its actions without scrutiny. At the same time, George IV's lifestyle added to the growing resentment. His extravagant spending, lavished residences, and visible indulgence stood in stark contrast to the economic hardships faced by many citizens. While the nation struggled with the aftermath of war and rapid social change, the king appeared detached, even indifferent. Political tensions further intensified the situation. Reform movements were gaining strength, calling for changes to a system that many viewed as outdated and unequal. The monarchy, once central to governance, now found itself positioned within a landscape increasingly shaped by parliament and public expectation. Each decision made by the king carried not only political consequences, but also symbolic weight. The attempted removal of Caroline ultimately failed, not because of legal impossibility, but because of public pressure. The government, recognizing the risk of further unrest, chose to withdraw the bill. It was a moment that marked a subtle yet powerful shift. The monarchy had not been overthrown, but it had been restrained not by force, but by the will of the people. For George IV, the outcome was deeply personal. His authority had been challenged and limited in a way that could not be easily reversed. For the monarchy as a whole, the implications were far-reaching. Power was no longer absolute, nor even assumeth. It was conditional, shaped by perception and dependent on acceptance. This confrontation did not end the monarchy, but it altered its foundation. The crown still stood, but it stood within boundaries that had been drawn not by tradition, but by chant. And once those boundaries were recognized, they could never be fully ignored again. Asterisk. The confrontation during George IV's reign did not end with a single resolution. Instead, it set in motion a series of consequences that would reshape the monarchy in ways both immediate and lasting. What had been exposed was not simply the weakness of one king, but the fragility of a system that could no longer rely on unquestioned authority. In the years that followed, the monarchy entered a period of quiet adjustment. George IV continued to reign until 1830, but his influence was increasingly limited. Public trust, once damaged, proved difficult to restore. His image remained tied to excess and detachment, and while the institutions of the crown endured, their connection to the people had been altered. The monarchy could no longer assume loyalty. It had to navigate it carefully. When William IV succeeded his brother in 1830, the situation demanded a different approach. Unlike George IV, William IV presented a more modest and restrained image. He did not carry the same reputation for extravagance, and his manner appeared more aligned with the expectations of a changing society. Yet the challenges he faced were far greater than personal perception. They were structural, rooted in a system that was under increasing pressure to reform. At the center of this pressure was the growing demand for political representation. The existing electoral system was widely seen as outdated, favoring a small and privileged segment of society while excluding large portions of the population. Industrial cities, which had grown rapidly in both size and importance, remained underrepresented, while smaller, less populated areas retained disproportionate influence. This imbalance became a focal point for reform movements across the country. The push for change reached its peak with the Reform Act of 1832. Legislation sought to address these inequalities by redistributing parliamentary seats and expanding the electorate. It was not a complete transformation, but it represented a significant step toward a more representative system. Formani, it was a long-awaited recognition that governance needed to reflect the realities of a modernizing nation. The passage of the Reform Act was not straightforward. It faced resistance from those who feared that expanding representation would undermine established power structures. Tensions rose as debates intensified, and the possibility of unrest loomed. In this critical moment, William IV played a decisive role by supporting the reform and, when necessary, using his authority to ensure its passage. He helped to avoid a deeper crisis. Yet this decision carried a deeper implication. In supporting reform, the monarchy effectively acknowledged the limits of its own power. Authority was no longer something to be defended at all, costs it was something to be adapted in order to survive. The crown had chosen to align itself with change rather than resist it. This moment can be understood as the true point of no return, not because the monarchy ceased to exist, but because its nature had fundamentally shifted. The balance between crown and parliament had been permanently altered. Political power now rested more firmly within elected institutions, while the monarchy assumed a role that was increasingly symbolic. For the Hanoverian dynasty, this transformation marked both a loss and a form of survival. They had relinquished direct control, but in doing so, they preserved their place within the nation. The alternative, a refusal to adapt, might have led to far greater instability, even the collapse of the monarchy itself. At the same time, the emotional cost of this transition should not be overlooked. For generations, kings had been raised with the belief that authority was inherent, that the crown represented not only power but identity. To accept its limitation required a read of that identity. The monarch was no longer the center of governance, but a figure within a larger system respected, but constrained. This shift also altered the relationship between the monarchy and the public. Where once loyalty had been expected, it now had to be earned. The crown needed to reflect the values of the people it represented, adapting to a society that was becoming more aware of its own voice. The distance that had defined earlier reigns was no longer sustainable. By the end of William IV's reign in 1837, the transformation was clear. The monarchy had not fallen, but it had been reshaped. Its authority was no longer defined by control, but by its ability to endure within a changing political landscape. The consequences of this period would extend far beyond a single generation. They would define the role of the monarchy for years to come, influencing how it was perceived, how it functioned, and how it survived. And in that survival lay a quiet paradox. The crown had preserved itself, but only by surrendering the power it once held. Asterisk. When Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837. The monarchy stood at a delicate crossroads. The turbulence of previous reigns had reshaped its foundations, leaving behind an institution that still carried prestige, yet no longer commanded unquestioned authority. At just 18 years old, Victoria inherited not only a crown, but the responsibility of redefining what that crown meant in a rapidly changing world. Her early reign was marked by uncertainty. Inexperience, combined with the weight of expectation, placed her under intense scrutiny. Advisors and political figures surrounded her, each seeking influence, each aware that the monarchy's future depended on how she would navigate this new role. Unlike her predecessors, she could not rely on tradition alone. The old model of authority had already faded. What remained was a position that required careful balance, visibly enough to lead, restrained enough to avoid overreach. Victoria's initial struggles reflected this tension. Her close relationship with certain political advisors raised concerns about impartiality, while her personal emotions occasionally intersected with matters of state. Yet these early challenges became part of a broader process of adaptation. She began to understand that her influence did not lie in direct control, but in the ability to shape perception, to embody stability in a system where power was increasingly distributed. A significant turning point came with her marriage to Prince Albert in 1840. Their partnership transformed not only her personal life, but also the public image of the monarchy. Together, they projected an image of domestic stability, moral responsibility, and dedication to duty. This was a deliberate contrast to the excess and controversy that had characterized earlier reigns. The monarchy, once distant and often criticized, began to appear more relatable, anchored in values that resonated with the public. Yet even as this new image took shape, challenges remained. Political reforms continued, expanding representation and further limiting the direct role of the crown. Social change accelerated with industrialization, bringing both progress and disruption. The monarchy had to remain relevant in a society that was evolving at a pace no previous generation had experienced. Victoria's response to these pressures was not to resist them, but to adapt alongside them. She embraced a role that was less about command and more about continuity, serving as a symbol of unity in a nation undergoing constant transformation. Her presence provided a sense of stability, even as the structures of power shifted around her. This period can be seen as the monarchy's final internal battle not against external rivals, but against It was a struggle to remain meaningful without the authority that it once defined it. And in that struggle, the crown found a new purpose not as the center of power, but as its enduring reflection. As Queen Victoria's reign progressed, the monarchy began to redefine itself, not through political dominance, but through symbolism, tradition, and cultural presence. This transformation was not sudden, but carefully shaped over decades, as the crown adapted to a society that no longer required it to govern, but still needed it to represent something greater than politics alone. One of the most powerful ways this new identity was expressed was through the creation of enduring symbols, traditions, and institutions that would outlast any single ruler. Public ceremonies became more than formal occasions. They were carefully crafted displays of unity and continuity. Events such as royal weddings, jubilee, and state processions drew widespread attention, reinforcing the monarchy's presence in the national consciousness. The Great Exhibition of 1851 stands as one of the most defining moments of this era. Organized under the guidance of Prince Albert, it showcased Britain's industrial and cultural achievements to the world. Held in the Crystal Palace, a structure of glass and iron that symbolized modern innovation, the exhibition brought together ideas, inventions, and people from across the globe. For the monarchy, it was an opportunity to align itself with progress, presenting the crown not as a relic of the past, but as a participant in the future. Beyond such grand events, the monarchy also reshaped its image through more personal symbols. Victoria and Albert's emphasis on family life played a crucial role in this transformation. Their public portrayal as devoted parents and partners offered a contrast to earlier perceptions of royal excess and distance. Portraits, writings, and public appearances all contributed to this image, creating a sense of familiarity that had previously been absent. The monarchy became not only a symbol of the state, but also a reflection of domestic values. Physical monuments further reinforced this legacy. Following Prince Albert's death in 1861, Queen Victoria commissioned memorials that would preserve his memory and, by extension, the ideals they had represented together. The Albert Memorial in London stands as one of the most striking examples of grand structure that embodies both personal loss and public tribute. Such monuments served a dual purpose. They honored individuals while also embedding the monarchy within the physical landscape of the nation. At the same time, traditions were formalized in ways that strengthened the continuity of the crown. Ceremonial practices, some rooted in older customs and others newly established, became integral to how the monarchy was perceived. The emphasis was no longer on demonstrating power, but on reinforcing stability. These rituals provided a sense of permanence, linking the present to the past and offering reassurance in a rapidly changing world. The expansion of the British Empire during this period also contributed to the monarchy's symbolic role. Victoria's title as Empress of India, adopted in 1876, reflected not only the scale of British influence, but also the crown's position at the center of that influence. While governance of the empire was largely conducted through political institutions, the monarchy served as a unifying figure, representing authority across diverse territories. Yet this symbolic strength carried its own complexities. The image of unity often contrasted with the realities of inequality and conflict within the empire. The monarchy's role was to embody cohesion, even when the structures it represented were far from uniform. This duality became an inherent part of its identity, projecting stability, while existing within a world of constant change. By the later years of Victoria's reign, the transformation was complete. The monarchy had evolved from a source of direct authority into a powerful symbol shaped by tradition, memory, and public perception. Its influence no longer depended on command, but on its ability to represent continuity in an age of progress. These monuments and symbols did more than preserve the legacy of a single reign. They established a framework that would define the monarchy for generations to come. And in that framework, the crown found a new kind of permanence not in control, But in the enduring stories it chose to tell about itself. Asterisk by the final years of Queen Victoria's reign, the transformation of the monarchy was unmistakable. What had once been an institution defined by authority had become one defined by endurance. The crown no longer directed the course of the nation, yet it remained deeply woven into its identity. This shift, though gradual, marked the closing chapter of the Hanoverian dynasty's direct influence over Britain. When Victoria died in 1901, it was not only the end of a long and defining reign, it was the end of the House of Hanover itself. With no direct Hanoverian successor in the British line, the crown passed to her son, Edward VII, inaugurating the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. The transition was smooth, almost seamless, reflecting how the monarchy had evolved into an institution capable of adapting without disruption. Yet beneath that smoothness lay the quiet conclusion of a dynasty that had once been chosen out of necessity and sustained through compromise. The Hanoverians had arrived in Britain as outsiders, selected, not by tradition alone, but by political calculation. Their rule had begun with uncertainty, shaped by distance cultural, linguistic, and emotional. Over time, they had secured their place, navigating rebellion, war, and internal transformation. They had overseen the rise of a global empire and witnessed the reshaping of governance itself. But their decline was not marked by sudden collapse or dramatic overthrow. Instead, it unfolded gradually, almost The monarchy did not lose its position, it lost its power. Authority shifted steadily toward Parliament, guided by reform, public expectation, and the demands of a modernizing society. Each adaptation ensured survival, yet each also moved the crown further from the center of decision-making. This quiet decline was, in many ways, a reflection of the dynasty's greatest strength. The Hanoverians had proven capable of change, recognizing when resistance would lead to instability. By yielding control, they preserved the institution of monarchy, allowing it to remain relevant even as its role diminished. It was a form of success defined not by dominance, but by resilience. Yet there was also a deeper cost embedded within this outcome. For generations, the monarchy had been tied to the idea of sovereign authority, the belief that the crown held not only symbolic importance, but real power. To transition into a primarily ceremonial role required a redefinition of identity, one that separated prestige from control. This shift was not always visible, but it shaped the experience of those who wore the crown. The end of the Hanoverian line also marked a broader change in how monarchy itself was understood. It was no longer an institution that stood above society, directing its course. Instead, it became one that existed within society, reflecting its values, its expectations, and its limits. The crown endured, but its meaning had been altered in Tisse. The Hanoverians did not lose the British crown in a single moment. They lost it gradually, through a series of choices that prioritized stability over authority, adaptation over resistance. The power they once held did not disappear, it was redistributed, reshaped, and absorbed into the structures that now defined the nation. And when the dynasty finally came to an end, it did so not with the fall of a throne, but with the quiet passing of a legacy that had already transformed beyond recognition. Asterisk. The story of the House of Hanover is not one of sudden, but of slow transformation so gradual that it almost hides itself within the passage of time. They arrived in Britain as strangers, chosen not by love or loyalty, but by fear and necessity. A dynasty built to protect a religion, to stabilize a throne, to prevent a return to a past the nation refused to face again. At first, they ruled with caution, then with growing confidence, and for a moment, it seemed as though they had secured everything: power, empire, and permanence. But power, once gained, does not remain unchanged. It evolves, shifts, and sometimes slips away not through force, but through time itself. The Hanoverians faced challenges that could not be solved with armies or authority alone. Rebellion across oceans, unrest within their own society, and a world that was beginning to question the very idea of inherited power. Each time, they chose adaptation over resistance. And each time, that choice preserved the crown but reshaped. What they ultimately won was survival. The monarchy did not fall. It endured, standing as a symbol of continuity in a nation that was constantly changing. But what they lost was something far more difficult to reclaim. They lost control. They lost the ability to shape events directly, to rule without limitation, to exist at the unquestioned center of power. The crown remained, but its meaning had changed. It no longer commanded, it represented. And perhaps that is the quiet truth at the heart of their legacy. The House of Hanover did not fail. It adapted so successfully that it made its own kind of power unnecessary. Because in the end, they did not lose the British crown in a moment of defeat. They lost it in the very process of ensuring it would survive.